Welcome to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum's Zoom series, Trolleyology. My name is Kristen Fredrickson. I'm the coordinator of volunteers, public outreach, and programming at the museum. Thank you so much for joining us today for this program in our 2021 Zoom series, and welcome back to those who have joined us before. This virtual series features programs on Pennsylvania transit history topics and stories of our collection that you can experience from the comfort of your home. And we plan to continue these programs regularly. So if you have a show that you'd like to share that fits the museum mission, please let me know. You can find my email address in the confirmation email that you got before this program today, or the reminder email. Anything about Pennsylvania, the trolley era, cities where our streetcars come from, that would all be a great program for Trolleyology. And you can see a full list of upcoming presentations at our website, patrolley.org, and I can share that in the chat box in just a few minutes. I think we don't have any other registrations open just yet, but stay tuned, we'll get those up shortly. And I want to extend a special thank you to those who donated when registering for tonight's program and those who have made donations throughout the year for Trolleyology through our website. We truly appreciate your support of our virtual programs. Okay, so we have some new folks here tonight. Of course, we have our regulars and some volunteers, but for those who might be new to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, we were established in 1954 as the Ardent Electric Railway by a group of trolley enthusiasts called the Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club. The museum opened to visitors a few years later in 1963 and is actually located along the route of the trolley line between Pittsburgh and Washington, PA. You'll find almost 50 trolleys here, about 20 of which operate, and it's a 4-mile scenic ride at the museum, about 30,000 visitors per year. And we are now open for our full summer schedule, Tuesday through Sunday, for the first time since 2019. From June to August, we are open these days, 10 to 4, last ticket sold at 3. So I hope you can come visit us. If you're planning some travel that you've been putting off for the whole pandemic, please come visit us and let me know you're coming. I'd love to say hello. Now, I would like to introduce today's presenters, Matt and Andrew Nawn, who are going to tell us about the electric railways of Hanover, PA. Matt is a licensed professional engineer who works full-time in the transit industry. He's a co-founder and director of the Friends of Philadelphia Trolleys, as well as a trustee of the National Capital Trolley Museum. Matt regularly assists several trolley museums in a variety of roles. And if he looks familiar to you, it's because he gave a program very recently with Harry Donahue about restoring PCC cars. And joining Matt tonight is his son, Andrew. Andrew Nawn is a student at Hanover High School with an interest in trains, trolleys, and local history. Andrew's a regular volunteer at the Baltimore Streetcar Museum, where he leads the museum's beautification committee and co-manages the next phase of the restoration of former Philadelphia snow sweeper C-145. Andrew aspires to be a future civil engineer and continue to grow as a volunteer in trolley preservation. Thank you guys so much for being here tonight. I would like to turn it over to you. Everybody, make sure you keep your microphones muted, videos turned off, and we'll see you at the end of the show. Take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Kristen. We are pulling up our slides here. We will share them here and get started. Bear with us just a second. All right, Kristen, hopefully you can see our screen and hear us.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, good evening, everyone. Andrew and I are really honored to be presenting here tonight and talking about the electric railways of Hanover, Pennsylvania, the town in which Andrew and I both live in. One thing Kristen mentioned, and I want to say at the start, this will be available again on Zoom, or excuse me, on YouTube later. All the materials in this presentation are items that Andrew or I either own the original print of, the negative, materials in our collection. Nothing in here is copyrighted as far as we are aware. So hopefully if you enjoyed it, you want to share the presentation, it will be available later on YouTube. So our overview tonight, we're going to talk about some background information on Hanover, Pennsylvania itself. We're going to talk about the Hanover McSherrystown Street Railway, our local streetcar system, the interurban line that connected Hanover with York. what's left, some of the, if you want to say, the ruins of the trolley era in Hanover, where you can find similar experiences today to what Hanover residents had to enjoy during the trolley era. We'll wrap up with a look at what Hanover is today in terms economically, and that'll be the end of our presentation. We've tried throughout this too to give you a little more than just the raw history of the trolley cars itself. Wherever possible, Andrew and I, as we started to do the research for this, found a lot of interesting things about local history. I mean, the theme is trolley cars, and that is what the presentation is centered around. But we've tried to, again, give more than just that limited, here's the cars, here's the details on the cars. We tried to talk more of the context and really some of the personalities behind it. We had a lot of fun researching this. And we're trying to preserve history by doing these. Our town has a great story and an interesting story of electric railway transportation, but every system was unique. And there's a story waiting to be told for each small town, each city that had streetcars, had an interurban. Hanover in that sense is just one of many. There are many systems which little is known about. Perhaps this will inspire some of the audience to share more about their town and their system. And as Andrew and I have been collecting material for this for the past several years, one of our future dreams, if you want to say, is that we would write a book on the streetcar system in Hanover. Whoops, there we go. So, welcome to Hanover. Dr. George Prowl wrote what's considered to be the best history of York County, Pennsylvania. It was multiple volumes in 1907. Perhaps he embellished a little bit as he quoted, "Upon a level plain almost unrivaled for its beauty and loveliness stands the prosperous borough of Hanover, Pennsylvania." An interesting twist, as we were going to talk about, there's a lot of personalities in this, a lot of connections. Dr. George Prowl was actually a relative to the late Todd Prowl, who was the founder of Railways to Yesterday, interestingly, today's Rock Hill Trolley Museum. Hanover itself, though, going back to our local history, the land itself was a land grant from Charles Calvert, who was also the 4th Lord Baltimore, to John Digges in 1727. So at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about trolley museums where you can get a similar experience, but I guess that means Baltimore technically has first dibs on Hanover since Lord Baltimore provided the land. The land started to be settled around 1730, particularly members of the Catholic faith from Maryland. And the land was disputed until Maryland and Pennsylvania settled their differences with the Mason-Dixon survey, or what's well known as the Mason-Dixon line. So oddly enough, the land grant from Maryland was probably not their land to give in the first place, but hence there was a survey. Hanover itself, it's located where it is because it is at a major crossroads. The main road from what was then an outpost on the Native American frontier lands in Carlisle, there was a main road to the Port of Baltimore. It runs through Hanover, and also an early route between York and Gettysburg runs through Hanover. The land itself was then further purchased by Richard McAllister in 1745, and he named it Hanover. As the legend goes, he named it Hanover because many of the local residents were of German descent, and he was trading with them, and this would keep the local population happy. So Andrew's going to tell us a little more about Hanover in the industrial era.
So Hanover grew quite substantially because of the Hanover Branch Railroad that opened on October 22nd, 1852. The Hanover Branch Railroad was the oldest predecessor of the Western Maryland, and a portion of this road is still in use today by CSX. And a direct road connection to Baltimore was established in 1877, further increasing our industrial growth. And as Hanover continued to grow with a 61% increase in population from 1880 to 1890, the Hanover borough population was 3,746 in 1890. And Hanover's industry included many products, including silk, wire cloth, castings, machines, brooms, and especially, as the title implies, shoes. And Hanover was also the birthplace of Matthias Forney. He was the designer of the Forney locomotive. That was, if you've seen pictures, it was used on elevateds in cities, elevated railroads. And he was also the founder of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, which is still growing strong. And these industries need workers, and workers need transportation.
So if you want to say one of the first improvements in local transportation beyond railroads was a turnpike. Now, if you're not familiar with the local geography, the name of the McSherrystown and Hanover Turnpike may give you a vision of something of great length. Well, Hanover and McSherrystown nearly touch each other. We're not talking about a distance of roughly a mile at most. But still, it was an early way to try and provide a better form of local transportation. Interestingly, the name is McSherrystown first and then Hanover, quite likely due to the fact that the largest investor in the turnpike was Vincent Obold. There was a building named after him, among others, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Mr. Obold was from the the western end of McSherrystown in Adams County. The turnpike itself was largely funded by Adams County residents. Hanover's at the western end of York County, but it was an early method of attempting to provide local transportation. But something more was needed. Hence, the Hanover and McSherrystown Street Railway Company was born, which was Hanover's first experience with public transit. So the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania issued what they called a patent, or we would call a charter, on September 30th, 1892, for a 3-mile street railway connecting the towns named in its charter. Again, 3 miles was more than the distance from Hanover to McSherrystown at its shortest point. It actually ran from what was then the western limit of McSherrystown to into Hanover through Center Square and to the southern borough limit along the Baltimore Pike. Capital of the new company was $30,000, and electricity was to provide the motive power from day one. Hanover, unlike many other systems, particularly older systems in the East Coast, never used horse cars. Although York did and other municipalities did, Hanover was intended and built as an electric railway from the start. To put the time frame in perspective, how early this was, the first electric streetcar had not yet operated in Philadelphia by the time the Hanover and McSherrystown was chartered. However, it took some time, and it wasn't until April of 1893 before the sufficient stock needed, 17,000 of the 30,000, had been subscribed. So a theme you'll hear throughout the presentation on the Hanover and McSherrystown: things change. Things don't always live up to expectations. That was not any different with the original charter. The original charter was designed to connect Hanover's Union Depot by streetcars. The route was then modified before construction began, and Hanover's train depot never had a direct connection with a streetcar. It was about half a block away. Contracts were issued in 1893. The favorite was a man named Mr. Favorite. We don't have any other data on him so far, but he received the contract to grade and construct the roadbed. And the S.D. Warfield Company of Baltimore received the contract to erect the poles, wire, supply 2 cars, the motors for the cars, and the substation equipment. So Andrew's going to tell you a little more about Hanover Union Depot, which again was never directly connected by the streetcars.
So, as he just said, this is Hanover Union Depot. On the left would be the Hanover Branch Railroad, which then became the Western Maryland Railroad, which is now CSX, and it is still used to seeing several trains a day. And then on the right, we have the Northern Central, which became the Pennsylvania, which then is now York Rail, and that is still active. It's not used as much as the CSX side, but both sides are different railroads and are both active.
And that sidewalk coming into the foreground would have connected with Carlisle Street, which is where the streetcars ran.
And this is today. Obviously, not much has changed. On the left, you can somewhat see the new library. In the back corner of that brick building, almost center of the picture, that is the Schmuck Lumber Company. It's been around since, I believe, 1852. Still going strong. And like I said, we got CSX on the left and York Rail on the right of the station.
So, not everything went according to plans, as we mentioned. Some of you who are historians may have heard of the Battle of Hanover, a cavalry battle that took place in Hanover the day before the much larger Battle of Gettysburg. However, some may say there may have been a second Battle of Hanover over the streetcars. And the Hanover Herald, one of the local papers at that time, ran a rather extensive story on this battle. So according to the Hanover Herald, Quite a small riot took place when the S. Deerfield Company, the contractor, attempted to erect wire across the Western Maryland Railroad tracks at Carlisle Street. It took until September, which was after the street railway had opened, to resolve the issue, drop all charges against the parties involved, and erect the missing section of wire. The Hanover Herald expressed its displeasure with the conduct of the railroad workers involved in the delay in opening the street railway. We'll see throughout, the Hanover Herald was rather enthusiastic about the street railway and didn't take too kindly to what it considered the big bad railroad delaying completion of its streetcar system. So more motivation was needed, and we're going to have Andrew tell us a little more about bringing on the band.
So these guys needed apparently a little motivation. Completion was getting close in August of 1893, so the McSherrystown band led a reported party of 100 men from McSherrystown to Carlisle Street in Hanover. I will mention this is not a great distance to cover, but it was impressive for them. And their goal was to encourage the men to excavate the ties to expedite completion. They were excited. And the Hanover Herald advised that they set to work with zealous energy. And while they worked, the band cheered them on with some excellent music. So they claim.
As we said, the Herald was rather, through our research, was rather enthusiastic about Hanover entering this modern age of streetcars. So on September 8th, 1893, the line is open. And this is actually Hanover McSherrystown car number 1. It was an early Brill car. We do, again, as I mentioned, this photo has been, I have seen this elsewhere, but everything in here, we at least own a legitimate copy of the photo. This was the end of the line at that point. You can see the rail ends, not even where the back platform is on the streetcar, at Mount Olivet Cemetery, a well-known cemetery with a lot of veterans in Hanover. And if you take note of the iron fence alongside the streetcar, today, the fence is still there. Mount Olivet Cemetery, of course, is still there. The wooden structure was later replaced by this brick structure. But here along Baltimore Street in Hanover, it's still, the fence in the area still resembles what it did when the Hanover McSherrystown made this its first terminus. So this is, and one of the things we found a great source of research, many of you are aware of these, are Sanborn fire maps. These are publicly accessible for non-commercial use. For example, Penn State's library has these. What we've tried to draw here as closely as we could, as clearly as we could, is the trolleys that served Hanover by 1908. So the red, if you can see that going around the square, is the original route from McSherrystown to south to Mount Olivet Cemetery. The green, we're going to talk in a few more minutes about Hanover McSherrystown's crosstown route. They called it the Penville and Stock Street extension. It shared some track at Center Square and Carlisle Street with the original route. And then towards the end of the presentation, we're going to talk about the York Railways Company and the interurban line to York, which we've tried to show here in blue. And some of that is actually on private right-of-way. So this is Hanover Square in 1905.
Yeah, as you can see, it had a nice little circle there. It had a fountain in the center, some cannons to commemorate the small battle that took place, and we also see a small single truck open car going around.
And it was said that the earliest open cars, based on a record we found, and we should say that to the best of our knowledge, we've not yet found any official corporate records. It's been a lot of research through trade publications, poor manuals, the Electric Railway McGraw-Hill's directory. Best we can tell, this was an early open car built by the Laclade Company of Chester, Pennsylvania, which was defunct prior to 1900. We think the lights may have been added later for night operation. But this is, and the postcard itself, we found was actually postmarked in 1905. This is the same view roughly today. You can see the old hotel in the background is still standing. The other buildings were replaced by what's now a rather ungainly armor-clad building. But that was the Shepherd and Myers building. It was rather interesting building architecturally, named after the founders of the Hanover Shoe Company. And we're going to talk more about their influence in just a moment. So, again, the Hanover Herald and the Evening Herald was rather enthusiastic, and they posed a question in September of 1893 that, are trolley wires dangerous? Now, I'm going to caution everyone that this is not guidance you want to follow, but Perhaps at that time, enthusiasm overtook safety, because the Hanover Herald had to say that it has been determined and now generally understood by electricians that a pressure of less than 800 volts cannot produce death in a healthy human being. The standard pressure used by all electric railway companies is 500 volts, and although this is by no means a pleasant shock to receive, a shock from the trolley wire might be comparable with the pulling of a tooth. It pains while it lasts, but is soon over. Well, of course, if you're really into electrical theory, of course, amperage plays the role. However, the voltage in the amperage which propels streetcars is lethal. And thankfully, today we have a better appreciation. And thankfully, most people I know in the trolley museum world seem to respect that as well. But enthusiasm overtook safety, one could say, in 1893. So the next extension was south, and that was to what they called Eichelberger Park. The Hanover and McSherrystown Street Railway extended its line, and this was a quote from a trade publication, 3/4 of a mile south. Okay, that's a generous estimate. It is not 3/4 of a mile from Mount Olivet Cemetery to where the park was, perhaps more like about 1/4 to 1/3 of a mile. But again, the arrow was one of enthusiasm, and it extended to what was later become Forest Park on June 25th, 1904. The park was on high ground. The land still is. It did provide excellent views of the surrounding area. The park offered various amusements, a picnic grove, and a dancing pavilion. And opening day did not necessarily go off without a hitch. Again, somewhat the checkered history of our local streetcar system. Well, the Knights of Pythias band rode a trailer that was fabricated to be towed behind one of the open cars, which, ironically enough, derailed while leaving the park on opening day. There were no injuries, but somewhat of an embarrassment with the opening. And Andrew will tell us a little more about the streetcar in the photo.
Yes, if you notice the streetcar, it's numbered 53. I will tell you, we never had that many streetcars. We had a meager amount of streetcars. The numbering system, as you will probably see throughout the presentation, is a bit haphazard. A lot of times, if they were to buy a car, it would keep its old number. At one point, they had 3 cars numbered 101. The numbers really had no rhyme or reason other than for car number 1.
So long story short, from 1893 to 1904, no, the company did not acquire 53 cars, which makes, in all seriousness, compiling a roster and finding out the exact number of cars and what cars they had to be a genuine challenge, one that we're still working on to this day. Eichelberger Park was owned by the Street Railway Company, not uncommon with many areas where the local streetcar company owned the amusement park, until 1926. At that point, with the ownership change, it was renamed Forest Park. Forest Park lasted until 1967, outlasting the street railway itself by 35 years. It was well remembered by residents of the area. The Hanover Area Historical Society has a lot of information, thankfully, on Forest Park, particularly in its later years. The park itself, after sitting idle, was demolished in 1971 and is redeveloped as the South Hanover Shopping Center, most unfortunately. But this is a present-day view of what would have been the park. And again, this was as far south as the Hanover and McSherrystown, at least along the Baltimore Pike, would ever get. So the next extension was a crosstown line. So construction began in 1906 west from Center Square along Frederick Street to the western borough limits of Hanover, as well as an extension to the north and east to the borough line near Ridge Avenue along what was then called Abbottstown Street, or today's Broadway, also Pennsylvania Route 194. They called the combined crosstown route the Pennville and Stock Street extension. Pennville was the neighborhood or village, if you want to say, at the western borough limits. Stock Street was up towards the north at that time in the borough. This was opened on June 5th, 1907. The new extension, as we mentioned, connected Pennville to the west with a neighborhood called Bunker Hill, much like the Boston neighborhood. It was a wealthy Hanover neighborhood at this time, a lot of architecturally significant houses, and then to the far, if you want to say, towards the eastern borough line. Again, the Hanover Herald was there on the scene and full of enthusiasm, and reported when the line opened that the impression made on the passengers as Stock Street was reached was that they were going through some suburban village. The houses with front verandas facing well-kept lawns and shade trees lining the sidewalks were suggestive of, quote, Suburbanville. This line, despite its great enthusiasm, would prove to be a complete financial failure. And actually, it's been speculated by the press at that time to block what was then a feared competitor coming to town, which we'll talk more about that feared competitor a little bit later. So the line itself only lasted from 1907 to 1915. So getting photos, finding photos on this, which are not otherwise printed, not otherwise copyrighted, or any in general, particularly on Stock Street, are next to impossible. So we tried to find some present day views, and it shows the neighborhood traversed, as the Herald talked about. A lot of larger, well-kept homes at that time, and even to this day, in what's called Bunker Hill. This is at Carlisle and Stock Street. The trolley would have approached from your left on Carlisle Street and then turned to face us and proceed along Stock Street. This is another view further down on Stock Street. If you're familiar with the local area, the former Eichelberger High School, now the Eichelberger Performing Arts Center, would be on our left. The former headmaster's house, the Eichelberger Academy, is in the foreground. You see still well-kept lawns, shade trees, relatively quiet and nice neighborhood. Again, just beyond this to the north was the northern borough limit of Hanover at that time. Now, ironically enough, what was Hanover and McSherrystown's least successful streetcar line today has public transit again. Local transit operator Rabbit Transit runs service on Stock Street. So by 1907, the system was relatively healthy. 500,000 passengers were carried. There were 3 closed cars available for colder weather, 7 open cars for warmer weather. And the system and its backers are ripe with enthusiasm for more extensions. They envisioned a much larger system. So they started shopping for cars. We're going to let Andrew talk about this next acquisition.
So in the picture, you can see car number 483, which they purchased from Boston in 1908 from the Boston Elevated Railway. As I mentioned earlier again, they did not have this many cars. It just kept its number from its previous owner. And that's what the next one says, apparently used with its Boston fleet number for a while. And it might have been for its entire life. They probably never renumbered it. And from a postcard, obviously this is a drawing, but from a postcard, it shows it with its Boston colors too. So they may also have never repainted it. And this car dated from 1892. It's the oldest car on the property. It's older than its own system right now. So it was a very old car.
And we've seen through the photos we've seen, we don't think it lasted all that long. And as Andrew mentioned, if you zoomed in the postcard, you'll see 483 on the number. And to confirm, this is definitely Hanover. Here's the same scene today. The trust company on the right is used for other purposes. Some of the same buildings are still in existence. This is just a short distance north of Center Square. So next came the longest extension of the system to Littlestown, Pennsylvania. Again, the press was ripe with speculation. The Hanover and McSherrystown would expand. Where would it go? Early in 1908, they commenced work on an extension from the western limits of McSherrystown to the borough of Littlestown. The extension was 5.5 miles long, which effectively doubled the track mileage of the little company. It was a relatively easy shot. There were very few grades, very few curves. The area, other than in Littlestown itself, was largely farm area. The company itself had a lot of enthusiasm. The company president, John Lanius, set a goal of July for opening the extension. Unfortunately, the date was not met. The actual opening didn't take place till August 2nd of 1908. The line was built to relatively good standards for its era. 60-pound rail was used, along with limestone ballast that was hauled by small ballast cars built in the company's shops, using parts of the first 2 cars they purchased. Hanover had a brief experiment with building trolleys. Andrew's going to tell us a little more about that in a moment. But this extension, for those that collect, both either in hard copy or electronic copy of the Electric Railway Journal, Volume 33, number 6, talks briefly about construction of this extension. Also, Brill's Magazine, J.G. Brill's company publication, had a story on it in 1908. And at the time, the system did purchase a number of single and double truck convertible cars from Brill, which, as far as we can tell, largely replaced just about everything else on the property at that time. So here's the end of the line in Littlestown, Pennsylvania. The track ends just to the left of the car. That would be the main intersection in Littlestown. This particular photo was taken not long before the end of service. We know that based upon the age of the automobiles in the picture. And similar to what York did for a while, some of the Hanover cars carried dash signs. They carried an L to Littlestown, or returning to Hanover carried an H with a sign that said Hanover. Here's the same view today in Littlestown. Many of the buildings remain the same. It's just simply the trolley cars are gone. But that car we saw in the previous photo really warrants a better description. And I think Andrew can tell the story of this unusual car probably the best.
So this is car number 200. Once again, a random out of order number. I don't know what they were thinking. It was home built in the company shops under the direction of Robert E. Manley. He was their general manager. They really wanted everything with this car. It was a passenger car. It had a smoking area and a baggage. And the smoker was really just in the baggage with a few benches. So it really wasn't all it was coughed up to be. And this is described in the April 30th, 1910 issue of the Electric Railway Journal. Now, the trucks were home built, like the car, using single trucks from original cars. They cut the trucks in half and bolted them back together to make two trucks. Brake components were from 5 different manufacturers. You can imagine maintenance on that. Also, the structure, parts of the structure were built from railroad rail. They only made one and only. It was never duplicated, but they did keep it a long time. It had long service life. And the passengers really didn't like it, though, and they referred to it as the cattle car.
The company was proud enough, though, to have its general manager mention it. The April 30, 1910 issue of the Electric Railway Journal describes this, and as Andrew kind of chuckled as he went through, everything he described is in there. It's quite an interesting read on this car. However, you know, we laugh about the car itself, but the man behind car 200 actually was quite well regarded. And although the street railway may have not been his most successful venture, he later went on to great success with engineering, and particularly components for the automotive industry. As we mentioned, Robert Manley was the general manager. He later found recognition as a manufacturer of shop equipment, primarily for the automotive industry. Although his company, the original company he started, United Engine and Manufacturing Company of Hanover, did make armature banding machines for electric railways. He's listed in some early electric railway catalogs. Products of his company, again, United Engine and Manufacturing, later became Manley Manufacturing Company, are still sought after and used by vintage equipment collectors and vintage machinists. We found a lot of research online. There are people who actively collect. They say the equipment was very well built, well engineered. Again, you know, his streetcar experiments, they did last, probably a little crude, but his equipment was no laughing matter. He was a member of the Engineering Society of York, which still exists. I'm a member. Andrew has gone to meetings with me as well. And interestingly enough, a descendant, I believe it's a grandson, started a company known perhaps to automotive enthusiasts called Manley Performance Products, which makes hardened valve and other components for high performance cars. You know, rather interesting that little unusual car started quite a business. Mr. Manley himself, that's his obituary on the left. He passed away in 1943. But again, a little more about his business, since it is tangentially at least related to the streetcar system. This is a 1915 cut from an issue of Motor World magazine, and you can see some of what the products he provided. I think he saw the future that, unfortunately for trolley enthusiasts, was not with the electric trolley car, but with the automobile. Back to the story of the street railway directly. The final extension came to what's called Conewago Chapel. This short branch left the existing line in McSherrystown and ran it through the village of Edgegrove to Conewago Chapel. It's a historic church that dates from 1787. It's a somewhat well-known local landmark, and this extension opened on July 16, 1910. That was another good year for the system. 600,000 passengers were carried in 1910. This branch, though, did mark the end of system expansion. There was further growth planned. This was just supposed to be the start. In fact, it was supposed to be the start of a line to the borough of New Oxford, which was just under 4 miles away from the end of track. The Hanover Herald, again, always the enthusiast for the street railway, reported on August 12, 1912, that the extension had been approved at the state level, but work did not commence. By 1914, it was reported the right-of-way had been secured. It didn't say owned, it just said secured, and construction would commence, but it was never built. By 1915, this was a moot point. The company had financial difficulties and had change of ownership for the company and a loss of local control further amplified the fact that these plans would never be met. This is the end of the line at Conewago Chapel. This particular photo was taken later in 1929. We'll talk about at the end of the Streets Railway story. The company did purchase secondhand Birney cars for only a few years, but this is the end of the line at Conewago Chapel. And in the present view, this is the same area. Of course, the waiting shelter is gone, but you'll see a railing and what we essentially call steps to nowhere off on your right. These steps are here. And again, this was the end of the line. This right-of-way, which is now used as a local farm road, ends at the pole line in front. There's actually a paved roadway there. These steps led up to the historic Conewago Chapel, or Father Jack's with us, I'm sure he would have known. It's the Basilica, minor Basilica of the Sacred Heart. Again, the stairs are still there. We believe at one time the farm road was used for access to the chapel, hence why there was iron railings. These are vintage railings, but I don't know if they were there on streetcar days. But you can see this was as far as the Hanover and McSherrystown would ever get towards New Oxford. So, life in Hanover during the streetcar era was a different time. You can see this was a view in 1922 of Center Square. There's one of the Brill single truck convertible cars. You'll notice too, if you look at some of the photos, the company couldn't quite decide how it wanted to letter the cars. After a while, it stopped lettering them all together. Early on, it said Hanover McSherrystown, an abbreviated street railway. Other cars were lettered H&M and spelled out the street railway. Here we have Hanover and MCS, an abbreviated street railway. I guess it depended what the mood was of the person painting the cars, because we have seen photos of each of these three configurations. Interesting to note here too, at Center Square, the track branching off to the left. This formed a connection with the York Railways and its interurban line to York. We'll talk more about this in the interurban story, but the York cars, for a time at least, would loop around Center Square to change directions before heading back out Broadway Street and then out towards private right-of-way. Also, based on this photo, you'll note by 1922, the extension, which would have been off towards the upper right to Frederick Street, even if you zoom in, you will not find the tracks at that date. Here's the square, the same view, 99 years after that photo was taken. And you can see some of the buildings still remain. A lot more traffic, unfortunately. The circle, if you want to say, and the area around Center Square has changed rather drastically to suit the automobile. So next, the Hanover Shoe Factory. This was along Carlisle Street. You can see here the line to, this was a car to Littlestown. You can tell by the L. This is one of the Brill double truck convertible cars. The shoe factory itself played a large role in the economy of Hanover. The building itself is still in existence, although the shoe company itself no longer uses it. This is the residence today at Hanover Shoe, but otherwise, other than the book donation box, not much has changed. Hanover Shoe left a tremendous legacy, though, in Hanover. Ironically enough, we have no record that they actually owned the street railway, which is one of the few things in Hanover. At one time or another, the owners of the shoe company did not have a stake in. The main factory, as we saw in the previous photos, and both founders' mansions remain as local landmarks. This one along Baltimore Street is today owned by the Hanover Area Historical Society. It's very nicely preserved. It's open for tours. The founders subsidized quite a bit in Hanover, from the two local dams, the waterworks, the local hospital, the local athletic complex. Even the surviving newspaper, the Hanover Evening Sun, was owned by the shoe company's founders. Other local manufacturing venues, some of which still exist, and the Hanover Shoe Farms. While the shoe company itself is long gone, Shoe Farms remains a multi-million-dollar business raising standard bred horses. But as we mentioned, unfortunately, both shoe manufacturing and streetcars have disappeared from Hanover, although the legacy of the shoe company still remains. Again, since our theme is shoes, streetcars, and snack foods, this is your shoe connection to Hanover. 1915, unfortunately for the company, was a year of disasters. I'll talk first about the financial disaster, and then we'll let Andrew talk a little bit about a natural disaster. So both the Hanover and McSherrystown Street Railway and its then affiliated Light, Heat, and Power Company were sold in 1915 to a holding company called Brooks and Company of Scranton, Pennsylvania. The company president then resided in Scranton. Brooks and Company, and if you research anything about public utilities prior to 1935, it's rather complicated. What company owns which, and who they own. Brooks and Company, for example, was affiliated with United Service Company, which was part of Keystone Public Utilities, or Keystone Utilities, which was a public utility holding company. And a holding company basically took various business venues of a utility, which often included streetcar systems, into one company. So we mentioned the holding company operated utilities and electric railways in a number of other municipalities besides Hanover. And even by this point, the most lucrative part of the business was not streetcars. It was electric and gas, being a supplier to generator for that. There was a brief period of time that the electric railway operations in York and Hanover were controlled by the same holding company at the high corporate level, but the operations themselves, despite a physical connection, were never consolidated into one. The Hanover operations, the control, later passed to a different holding company affiliated with trolley operations in Reading, Pennsylvania, Norristown, and Lebanon, as well as other states. In fact, Norristown will play a role in the final cars that came to our street railway. Also in 1915, the new owners realized the Pennsville and Stock Street extensions, that crosstown route, was just a money loser. And the street railway and the borough of Hanover disputed the cost of track removal. They suspended service. The borough said, you will pay to remove the track. The street railway didn't like the figure. They did finally settle by agreeing to pay $4,400, and the track on this line was removed. However, that was not the only disaster. I'm going to let Andrew tell us about a natural disaster the same year.
Yeah, so in downtown Hanover, we were devastated by a tornado on August 21st, 1950. It hit Center Square on Saturday evening. Damage was estimated at $300,000. This is 1915 figure. In Hanover McSherrystown Street Railway car number 30, it was once again a random number, and it was likely a secondhand purchase from an unknown source. Seems to be a recurring theme. On the combined Stock Street and Frederick Street crosstown route, was blown off the tracks. And according to contemporary reports, a young lady named Marie Hildebrands are still in the area, was riding the trolley at the time with her father. He was a conductor, Monroe Hildebrand, and they escaped serious injury. And the Hotel Old Bulge, you'll see pictures later, which was the terminus for the interurban to York, it lost its roof. And it was reported that the 6,600 volts AC, that's the overhead power for the interurban line, was downed, and an axe-wielding local councilman broke the box holding the manual disconnect breaker and shut off the power.
So besides the disaster, even had a reported act of local heroism. So as the system continued to go on in years, as Andrew mentioned, a number of cars were acquired. This is the biggest mystery we have of the system. We found this photo and purchased it in a local antique store. The individual on the far left was Bill Moore. His descendant, Harold Moore, later framed the photo based on the notes on the back. This is the only photo, this is the only reference we have to car 101. Based on the notes on the photo, there is no doubt it's in Hanover. Based on the building in the background, that is definitely the Hanover McSherrystown Street Railway car house. Now, where did this car come from? So, we don't know. We don't know how long it lasted. And as Andrew mentioned, there were 3 cars numbered 101 at the time, and at least 2 of them were on the property at the same time. There was also a closed car, or convertible 101. This car, so we looked at big city rosters. It's not from Philadelphia, not from Baltimore, not from Washington. We then looked at different street railways owned by the holding company. It's not from Reading, Wilmington, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Chester, Pennsylvania, the Jersey Central Traction Company. We couldn't find anything. The only possibility, and I say possibility, could be the Rutland Vermont Street Railway, because it was owned by the same holding company at that time. This was after the Hanover system was more affiliated with the streetcar system in Reading and elsewhere, but they also owned the Rutland streetcar system based on electric railway directory of 1924. That year, Rutland abandoned service. You can see this car has obviously had some work done to it, and the photo was taken based on the notes in 1925 or 1926. We're not ready to say it's from there, but we're running out of options. But unusual, as I said, this is what we know is the only double truck open car the company owned. Now, here's almost the same location. Track 6 would have been under the windows and doors sign on the far right. We'll talk more about the car barn in a moment, but the Hanover and McSherrystown Street Railway, the car barn does still exist. In fact, one of the participants mentioned they used to own this building, and that's rather fascinating to us. So yeah, let's talk some more about the car barn. This is from a Sanborn fire insurance map, and based on that and some published information from Brill's magazine and elsewhere, we know that the original facilities were the smaller buildings closest to the railroad tracks on the left. There's a carpenter shop, a machine shop, and then what was then called the repair barn. Around the time of the Littlestown extension, the 200-foot-long storage barn, which is the long pink building on the right, was constructed. It's interesting to note, as we said, there's a lot of interesting aspects of the local streetcar system. Sanborn noted that men on duty at night, there are two, okay? There's men on duty at night, there's 2 outside hydrants with no hose. Well, I guess they get an A for effort. By 1931, however, the time of the trolley was running out for Hanover. This particular photo is of car 101, the convertible version of 101, on North Street in McSherrystown. We've not been able to place this photo. We looked at existing structures on North Street in McSherrystown. Many of them are older. The only thing we could possibly come up with is this site behind the car was later used for what became today St. Teresa of Calcutta School on the McSherrystown campus would be behind the car. Interesting to note too, this was taken in July of 1931. And by this time, the shops were not converting the convertible car anymore. But the convertible car, most of the side would come off. You can see here, they were not removing the sides anymore at this point, just letting passengers open the window. And this particular photo was taken by a man named Carl Sensi. He took a number of photos of other street railways in central Pennsylvania at that time, primarily around 1930, 1931. I don't have any information about him otherwise, unfortunately. We purchased a collection of some of his photos, which includes this one. But he did date it well, and it's July of 1931. Another view of one of the convertible cars towards the end of service. This photo dates from about 1929. It's here in Hanover Square. Again, nice warm day. You can see the trees are in bloom. Some men are resting on the benches in the shade. But the convertible car is not being converted anymore, probably just too labor intensive. You can see, as I mentioned, what was called the Shepherd and Myers building in the background behind the trees. Here's the same view today, almost the same spot. Of course, the oval or the circle is gone, but you can see the Shepherd and Myers building behind the Armor, as well as some of the local microbreweries, which have sprung up in recent years in Hanover. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of the line for the Hanover streetcars. For example, automobile registrations in Pennsylvania grew from 468,000 in 1920 to over 1.5 million by 1930. The streetcars simply couldn't compete anymore. You saw in the last photo all the automobiles in the square. This would only continue to grow. In 1929, the local system did carry 600,000 passengers, but keep in mind that's only 100,000 more than 1907, despite the fact that the borough population grew by 60% in the same period. As representative of this decline, the holding company that owned the street railway sold it to different owners in 1930. This was characteristic with other street railways owned by the same holding company. The Reading Street Railway was sold that same year. The Schuylkill Valley traction was sold the same year. The Lebanon system closed that year. And likely for economic reasons, 6 secondhand Bernie cars were acquired from Norristown, which had formerly been at least corporately affiliated with the company, in 1929. The best of our research with the 1929 date and the 1930 sale of the system, this was probably little more than a paper transfer, but it explains why Norristown lost 6 cars and then later went to buy 6 replacements from somewhere else. Still, even with the Bernie cars, which were small 4-wheel cars, they were called safety cars, could be operated by just one person. Income still could not meet expenses or the bond interest, and the streetcar system closed on January 19, 1932. Unfortunately, different from the York story, no cars are known to have been sold for further use in any capacity, rail or otherwise. We did find a contemporary report that stated that the remaining cars were burned near the junction of the line to Conewago Chapel, which branched off around 2nd Street in McSherrystown. And Lancaster trolley enthusiast James P. Schumann took notes of a visit to Hanover on September 17th, 1933, and noted that at that time only Bernie cars 104, 105, and 106 remained on the property, and every other car had been destroyed. So the street railway ended, but Hanover until 1939 still had an interurban, a heavier built, faster electric railway connection to York, Pennsylvania, where it was Hanover's connection to its local big city. So it was a long time coming. I'll let Andrew tell us the early history.
So, as early, very early as 1902, just a few years after the Hanover and McSherrystown, promoters proposed a line to connect York with Gettysburg. And then in 1904, the York and Gettysburg Street Railway was organized, but they lacked interest. That's usually what killed things. But then finally in 1907, the York County Traction Company incorporated the Hanover and York Street Railway to build a heavy interurban line from York to Hanover via Spring Grove.
This line actually was built. And again, the York system is much better known than the Hanover system. We could talk a whole separate presentation or multiple on York. So we're just going to focus on that interurban line since it was a direct run to Hanover. This is actually an original invoice from the engineers who did the survey work for it. The line was built under the name Hanover and York Street Railway. It was anything but a street railway. But this is the invoice, and this was also for paying the commissary bill. This was a unique operation, this line. It was 18.5 miles from Center Square in Hanover to Center Square in York. It was unlike anything else in central Pennsylvania, or even northern Maryland for that matter. It was heavily constructed. The line had substantial cuts and fills. Typically, country trolley lines followed the lay of the land. This was built more like what was called a steam railroad. It used 75-pound rail, genuine rock ballast, had steel bridges, block signals, and there was not a single crossing at grade with any steam railroad between York and Hanover. Even more interesting, the line was constructed as a 6,600-volt single-phase alternating current operation, except for street running in York and at least partially in Hanover. I don't want to go too technical, but if any of you are familiar with the technology street railways, they were almost exclusively 550 to 600 volts DC. This was an experiment. Westinghouse at one time promoted this type of system. It would have been much more suitable, perhaps, to a larger system. The system was thought to one day build to Baltimore, to Frederick, perhaps to Washington, but it never got beyond Hanover. The Electric Railway Journal called these Pullman-type passenger cars. They're not Pullman cars, but that was their description. The original cars to open this line were 4 cars capable of running in multiple unit trains, meaning one operator, one motorman could run up to 3 cars. They were built by the Niles Company just for this operation. They were not used anywhere else on the York system. They could run on 600 volts, but they were designed to run on the AC. The line opened and carried its first passenger from Hanover to York on February 29th. Yes, it was a leap year, 1908. Running time was 55 minutes, and there was a car every hour. Today, with traffic, getting between the center of York to the center of Hanover in 55 minutes is not always attainable. So the cars did operate. It was 45-mile-an-hour service in the countryside. So up to date, this photo, this has been reprinted a number of times. Unfortunately, it's not really clear. This is actually an original postcard. Many copies were made, but this is an original postcard mailed from Mengus Mills, which is a little village between York and Hanover in 1908. It provides a brief description from the sender talking about their new line, and it says, as it's quoted here, it's up to date. These really represent the art of wooden car building at the time. You can see the pantograph is up for the AC power. It gives you an idea. It's rumored that 6 cars were ordered, but only 4 were actually built, along with 1 freight car. Here's the operation in its earliest days. We're in Center Square again. The Obold Hotel is that building on the far right, somewhat cut off, the one that Andrew mentioned. And it's looking towards Broadway. Interestingly enough, every building in this scene is still standing, as we can see here in this modern day photo. You can also see that wall next to the Obold Hotel. That was the original roof line prior to the tornado. As we mentioned, this line didn't have a single at-grade crossing with any steam railroad. This was the bridge over the Western Maryland tracks, the original Hanover Branch Railroad on your left, and the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was on the right, and there's a siding with some gondolas. It was a steel trestle erected over the railroads to avoid a grade crossing. This was on a short stretch of private right-of-way within the borough. Today, this is almost the same view. To get to that exact spot, it required walking down an active railroad. I didn't want to trespass, so I'm at the closest spot zoomed in, about where that white projection is on the building on your left is where the trestle would have been. That brick house in the far center background was in the previous photo. The railroad is still active. However, the trestle is long gone. So in 1921, the line was re-equipped. This also got mentioned in the Electric Railway Journal. There were several reasons. The alternating current system proved to be cumbersome to maintain on the cars themselves. You needed both the capability to run on direct current as well as alternating current. And it was especially cumbersome when you consider the fact that the rest of the system used direct current only. It also meant if a car was in the shop, it couldn't be used. They couldn't have another car to run to Hanover. The original cars pulled in at a whopping 43 tons, and it was reported that when they started in the streets of York, they drew a tremendous amount of power. As we mentioned, they could only be used on the Hanover line that limited their flexibility. The line was rebuilt for DC, direct current in 1921, and 6 new cars were purchased. The intent was to give 2 spare cars that could be used elsewhere. These new cars were more than 15 tons lighter. They're still rather large cars, but there's tremendous weight savings. They were DC only. They could match the speed of the older cars, and they could still be run in trains of up to 3 cars. But being the thrifty system it was, 2 cars are just too good to discard, so they became freight cars. So here we see former car 500, car 09 demoted to freight service. This is at the square, just west of the square, or east of the square in Hanover. What's interesting about this 1935 photo was Hanover had a dedicated freight house. It was near the trestle. Why the freight motor was in at the layover point, the later layover point near the square, is a mystery we've never been able to find out. We don't know whether it was chartered by a group of enthusiasts, or probably more plausibly, at times the system was hired and was consigned to haul freight. In fact, they moved one business from Hanover to York and all its contents. Quite possibly that's the reason, but seeing a freight car in the square in Hanover was really uncommon. Here's the same car again on the trestle over the 2 railroads. This also, as I recall, dates from 1935. Here's the same view today in 2021. I'd be standing at what would be the end of the approach to the trestle. Now, it's interesting. Through our research, we found one local source that stated, it was anecdotal, the trestle was on Walnut Street. This was part of the value of the Sanborn fire insurance maps. We also were fortunate to get a copy of the Western Maryland property map for Hanover. It was actually in what's today an alley, just it was not in a public street, the trestle itself. And like I said, we're standing here just about what would have been the end of the approach to the trestle. The trestle has been entirely removed. Now, you could get a lot of mileage from this ticket, but there's more to the story, and I'm going to let Andrew tell this one.
So you'll notice the last name on this ticket is to a Schaefer. I don't know if this one's related to me, but I am related to Schaefer's. My great-grandmother, she's going on 94 this July. She has vivid memories of riding the York Railways line to Hanover. Now, she never rode all the way to Hanover, very unfortunately, but she did ride Spring Grove to York. So she did ride the line. She remembers the cars, the experience. She's a great resource. And also, in a way, I am related to a motorman of Hanover. Uh, my great-grandmother's husband, he has been deceased for quite some time now, but he never really got to know his mother because when he was very young, she ran away with a motorman from Hanover. So I'm related to a motorman.
As Andrew mentioned, thankfully, his great-grandmother does still have a very vivid memory. She's in excellent health. He recorded her memories a few years back. She is the only person we have found in 2021 still living who can remember riding an interurban car on the Hanover line. Unfortunately, we've yet been able to find a first-hand account of riding a streetcar in Hanover. They disappeared in 1932. His great-grandmother was 5 at the time, and she still lived in York. But thankfully, Andrew preserved this. And as he said, he is, in fact, related to a motorman. We're not clear. It may have actually been a Hanover McSherrystown motorman because the individual was from Hanover. As automobile traffic grew, the interurban became less popular. You can see here in 1938, car 325. This was one of the cars built to re-equip the line in 1921. Had to do some battles here in February with quite a bit of automotive traffic. Compounding the problem was the fact that the car had to run for about a car length against the flow of traffic. If you look in the foreground, you'll see paved over areas either of the rails or where the rails were. When the Hanover McSherrystown, the streetcar system, was abandoned in 1932, apparently they owned the track around Center Square. At least for a time, York Railways cars used the track as a turnaround and came out on the track in the foreground, so they would be moving with the flow of traffic. Well, after the end of the Hanover McSherrystown, whether it could be purchased or it was declined, we don't know. York had to put a switch in, and again, the car will have to change ends and fight traffic for about a car length before it gets on the other side of Broadway. Here's the same view in 2021. Traffic hasn't gone away any, but you could see the building in which the cars laid over in front of, and also what was formerly the Hanover Shoe Outlet. Hanover's last trolley came to an end on February 4th, 1939, with the end of the interurban railway to York. That also coincided with the end of streetcar service and suburban service in York. Much like Hanover, the York-based system was owned by a public utility holding company. For those who are enthusiasts of the Midwestern electric railways, the Insel, one of the Samuel Insel's companies at one time, owned the York Railways. Something that helped the demise of the system, and in fact helped the demise, unfortunately, of systems throughout the United States, was the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935. This forced utility companies to divest in non-utility interests, such as trolley operations. This, in fact, didn't really hurt the utility companies because the trolley operations were often largely funded by profits from the sale of electricity, steam, or gas. The trolley system was sold off in the late 1930s to new owners who planned for an all-bus operation simply as a matter of economy, especially now they'd be paying for the power and paying to maintain the rails and the overhead. Thus, on Saturday, February 4th, 1939, the last trolley to operate in Hanover departed for York, ending nearly 46 years of electric railway operation within Hanover Borough. Removal of the line commenced almost immediately, and this view, taken in September 1939, shows the trestle, we've seen a couple photos, being demolished. The crane is actually on the Western Maryland, and the Western Maryland's property map noted the date in September of 1939 when the trestle was in fact removed. So, we've talked about the system. What's left to remember this era? Unfortunately, not a whole lot, but there are some tangible evidence, if you want to say, the ruins of our system, which still can be found if you know where to look. Some of the cars did find other uses. Now, as we mentioned, unfortunately, we don't know of any Hanover McSherrystown car which survives even as part of a building or elsewhere. Anything is possible. But to say that one is buried in a building somewhere, at least a Hanover car, is little more than speculation without support. However, a number of cars from York were sold for other purposes, including cars which did or could have run to Hanover. In fact, some of York's most modern city cars were sold to Porto Alegre, Brazil, after the end of service, although it may have just simply been a paper transfer again. Public utilities own the street railways in Brazil, as well as the running gear from cars. But York also sold a number of the car bodies for other uses. This was car 324. It was used as an advertisement for the York Rug Company. Oddly enough, this car later was moved to Shenandoah, West Virginia, near Harper's Ferry, and became part of a clubhouse, as we understand. I last saw photos of it in 2016. The property was for sale roughly 3 to 4 years ago. The 2016 photos, the car perhaps still exists, but the car was pretty skeletal. It was pretty decrepit. There wasn't a whole lot left of it. Not sure if there's really enough, again, if the car still exists, there's really even enough to ever preserve, but it did last a long time in non-rail use. Here within Hanover, probably the most tangible reminder is the former car barn, which we've talked about already along High Street, or at that time, the High Street extension when the line was built. It's used as a landscaping company as well as a surplus store. We've been able to go in, the owners, or at least the tenants, were very gracious to let Andrew and I go in, look around at various times. This view is taken where the former yard would have been at the car house. Here's the view inside. If you look to the back wall, you can see the heavy brick header, which would have been below that was all open for access to for the cars. That was later bricked in. You can see the style of roof trusses and the construction of the building. There's rail inside. Well, sort of. If you look in the center of the photo, one part of the building prior to its current use had an overhead traveling crane, if you want to say, and it used T-rail. You can see that right in the center. That is a piece of rail suspended from the roof trusses. We don't know. Was this dug up from the floor? Was this dug up from the yard? Or was this just acquired somewhere else? We don't know. But interestingly enough, there is still, well, in some form and in some places, rail in the car house. Another reminder are the trestle abutments where the Hanover and McSherrystown crossed Plum Creek. This is at the far western borough limit of McSherrystown. Oddly enough, there's still anchor bolts, or the remains of them, on this concrete abutment. One has to wonder if the residents wonder what the heck this thing is in their backyards. This is a close-up of it. I mean, it's weathered, it's deteriorated, but this held up the trestle to cross the creek. This is the view from the top of the abutment looking towards Brushtown. You can see the right-of-way. There's so much vegetation, I've not been able to determine if the other abutment is still there. You can see the right-of-way shortly before it goes through the parking lot of a local food line and then through a development, although much of the right-of-way is still at least identifiable. And this is another view. That is the end of North Street in McSherrystown. If you see where the paved area ends, you can see if you look to where the automobile's parked on your left. It's graded. This was, part of the right-of-way. This part of the property is now part of the park, which is adjacent. Ironically enough, the York Railways and Urban Line lasted the longest in Hanover, but within Hanover, there's virtually no remnants. The former freight house lasted a long time. It has since been demolished. The trestle is gone in its entirety. Although a very tangible part is the Hanover Trolley Trail. It continues to be extended at various sections. Oddly enough, the right-of-way was saved because it provided access to a high voltage utility line, which an agreement was later reached to use it for a trail. This view was taken along Broadway Street. There was double track on this street. This was a rather nice residential and say light commercial area. You can see some of the homes and the trees in this section of Hanover. It's not too hard to picture what it would have looked like with double track here and interurban cars on this street. Now, some other remnants of cars that may have operated in Hanover. This particular structure, 5 cars make one house. This is near the village of Yo, somewhat south of York, and it is a house fabricated out of 5 former York Railways car bodies, at least one of which was if you want to say a suburban car, possibly one of the cars that were used to re-equip the Hanover line in 1921. Joel Salomon took these photos and shared them with us. Thank you, Joel. Andrew and I and Joel explored these cars about 2009. The owner was very gracious. He actually let us in. I guess we didn't look threatening, thankfully. You can see here in this view, the car on the right has a much larger headlight. And you'll see in a moment, the dash is much larger. It's definitely not a city car. We don't know, again, was it one of the 320 series cars? Was it another? York did have other cars, suburban cars, which occasionally did run to Hanover after 1921. An interesting story, when we were in the house, the owner explained to us that a plumber was doing some work some years back under the bathroom, and in the crawl space found the gong was still there. So I guess perhaps if you rang the gong, you got toilet paper. And you can see here, there's that end of the car. You see how the dash, it does drop further down, the anti-climber, that piece that's sort of rib steel is a little bit larger. Is it a Hanover car? Don't know, but it is a well-maintained house today. And again, the residents who we last met were very gracious and told us what they knew about the car. This car, another one's rusting away in peace. This is the local post office is East Berlin, Adams County, but this is nowhere near the actual town of East Berlin. It's about 8 miles away. This is one of the 3 curbside cars which York owned, which were used on the suburban lines. There is evidence they were occasionally used to Hanover. This particular car has been here for a number of years. It's pretty clear. Andrew and I drove by this spot. It is well posted if the owner did not invite you to their property to not trespass, which we did not do. We went to a public road, took some photos across the field. We did not disturb the owner. Again, it is abundantly clear, at least the current owner, not to bother them, and we respected their privacy. You can see the end of the car here. I've seen photos from roughly 2008, 2009. The car was decrepit then. Unfortunately, some would say anything is savable, but the feasibility of stabilizing and restoring the car if the owner wanted to sell it, and then finding the components for running gear would be very expensive and maybe not practical. But at least another remnant of the system still exists. Now, this is probably the toughest way to find a former Hanover interurban car. That is your co-presenters this evening. We are standing on the ruins of what was former York car 500. We saw that in some other photos. One of the Niles cars, the wooden cars, were holding a piece of the threshold plate. The car was later used as a cabin well south of York for many, many years. And then later collapsed, was abandoned, collapsed in on itself. Joel had the address, so we made a trip in 2009 to see it. We found this piece. It's just a nondescript threshold plate, which ironically enough still hangs in our garage. But we probably took the last ride on car 500 because shortly after this photo was taken, we stood on what was the floor of the car, and it collapsed with Andrew and I on it. Thankfully, we only fell about armpit deep into the crawl space. Andrew climbed out, as did I. Maybe it's good I'm 20 pounds lighter now. But we would say we're probably the last people to take a ride on this car. I haven't been back since. Like I said, at that point, it was just a series of ruins. I don't even know if that still exists anymore. There were trees growing through the car. If you find it, I don't recommend trying to walk on it. So we can't necessarily bring back to life a Hanover car, or at least a car that ran in Hanover. But thanks to the magic of trolley museums, we can experience a little bit of what it was like. So geographically closest to Hanover is the Baltimore Streetcar Museum. Andrew, why don't you explain this car a little more for us?
So this is Baltimore Traction Company 554. It's a single truck open car, just like Hanover had, almost identical. That's me at the controls. Yeah, it's probably the closest thing you can find to the single truck open cars that ran in Hanover.
There's not a lot of cars of this vintage left. Again, this is not a car that ran in Hanover, but physically and experience-wise, almost identical. Baltimore provides a unique experience in that it actually operates trolleys in an urban area, provides a different experience. But yes, Andrew, like to pose for the controls of this car. Baltimore also has a double truck open car, number 1164. It's considerably improved since this photo was taken, but this was similar to Hanover's mystery car, 101. Not the same car with the same number of benches, provides, again, a similar experience. Perfect car on a nice hot day. There are plenty, no, not plenty, unfortunately. There are a handful of open cars left. This is one of the oldest. Baltimore, among the other gems, also has a vintage convertible car. This particular car, 264, is somewhat older than the cars used in Hanover. You see the roof is different. It is not the same, but it is probably the closest surviving convertible car, similar to what Hanover used. So again, provides a similar experience. A little further away from Hanover, about an hour and 25 minutes, is the National Capital Trolley Museum. Among the gems of their collection is the single truck car 522. You can see in the background, like the car purchased from Boston, it has a portable dash. The construction is somewhat similar to Hanover's earliest open cars. The brick car barn is reminiscent of the Hanover McSherrystown barn, although they never had a car barn that was quite as nice as what National Capital has. The line itself runs along through a park reminiscent of Whitmer Park, which was midway between Hanover and Littlestown. It was just a picnic grove. Oddly enough, you see in the foreground the 1899 vintage snow sweeper 09. One of the more unusual discoveries we found is that we could not find a single instance of Hanover and McSherrystown having a single piece of snow fighting equipment of any kind, a sweeper, a plow, anything. Seems rather odd, but so far, we've not found anything on that. Shoreline Trolley Museum in Connecticut has the closest thing to a Hanover McSherrystown Bernie car. Hanover McSherrystown did not have a car from the Connecticut company, but this Osgood Bradley built Bernie car is identical to what Hanover had. This is from an old postcard. This car still exists today. The Mannheim Historical Society provides a really unique experience for small town Pennsylvania. This is another Bernie car, different than what Hanover had. I mean, similar, but not identical. This is from the Lancaster City system. You can see Andrew and I here. We do help them out occasionally, particularly car maintenance. And this operation was Sundays only in the warmer months. It is going to reopen now that COVID has ended. It just takes you a block from the restored train station to an area of a small business where they hand blow glass. It's a block long, but it provides that small town experience on a car. You know, it's not hard to imagine what it would have been like to ride a short distance on a Hanover McSherrystown streetcar. A little further from Hanover, about an hour and 45 minutes away, is the Rock Hill Trolley Museum. They have the only completely restored York car in existence, car 163. This car is similar. It is not a car that ran to Hanover. It's a city car. It didn't have the same fittings as an interurban car to Hanover, although York did have 3 larger versions of this, which did run to Hanover. This gives you an idea what the York cars looked like in their later years, the orange, red, and cream colors. Rock Hill runs along, near the mountains, very different from anything you'd experience in York County, but the car itself gives people an idea of what it would have been like to ride a York car into Hanover. So Hanover today in 2021, we'll let Andrew wrap up here for us.
So right now our population is 15,719. I mean, give or take a few. We are deemed the snack food capital of the world. We have Utz, as picture shows. That's quite famous. I believe it's their 100th anniversary this year. We also have Snyder's. That's now Campbell's Snacks, but that's also from here. We have Bachman, and we have several more in and around the Hanover area, so that's how we got our name. And unlike a lot of places in Pennsylvania, manufacturing remains, and it's a key staple to our economy. We have quite a bit of it. Most of it's specialty. We have Elsinore, Aquafenix, just to name a few. Yeah, we got a lot of manufacturing still. And the downtown's really revitalizing. We have several luxury apartments now and that are coming. A lot of microbreweries, and downtown's really becoming a hopping place. We also have a new history museum by the Historical Society. in return of streetcars? Probably not, but I mean, never say never, but most likely not, no.
And as we start to wrap up, public transit still exists in Hanover in 2021. There are 3 local bus lines which serve the immediate Hanover borough area and the adjacent areas. There's also a bus line to York. This was ironically the bus route that lasted until the 1960s. It replaced the interurban cars. And also a line to Gettysburg, something that no electric railway was ever able to do in central Pennsylvania. The service is provided by Rapid Transit. That's the business name of the Central Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, which provides service to 10 different Pennsylvania counties. And Rapid Transit is also the service provider for the systems located in York and Gettysburg proper. So they want you to hop on and ride. Not quite the same as the ride. That's a different form of Rapid Transit with a former York car. But they believe the catchy marketing in the name will encourage, hopefully, people to ride and utilize our local public transportation system. And Andrew and I wrap up with what we thought was the last trolley car in active use to carry a York sign on it. This was in Toronto, Ontario. And thanks to a friendly motorman, we were able to pose with a photo that said York. Wish we could have posed with one that said Hanover, but that's all we could do. At this point, that represents the end of our presentation. We really appreciate your interest. I saw most of the group hung in there. Kristen, we'll turn it back over to you and be glad to do some questions and answers.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. If you have any questions for our presenters, you can put them in the chat, or in just a few minutes, we will open up for questions. And before we get to that, though, I do want to let you guys know this is not our only Trolleyology presentation. We've got more coming up. George Gula will present about the Laurel line. So we're kind of staying over on the east side of the state. And then in August, we will have a show from Father Jack called Carline Adventures, which should be really interesting. It's got some, it's research he's done from newspapers and found lots of interesting trolley stories. So those will be coming up soon. And I do want to thank everybody again for joining us today. If you enjoyed the program, please consider making a donation at patrolley.org/support. And you can support us in lots of ways. You can become a member, a volunteer. We've got about 125 active volunteers at the Trolley Museum. And thank you so much again to those who donated during the registration process for this program. All right, so I am going to make it so that anyone can unmute themselves, getting some nice comments in the chat. Give me 1 second here. Allow participants to unmute themselves. Okay, so if you do have a question, you should be able to unmute yourself. And I also invite you to turn on your video if you so choose. So I'll start mine. All right. Well, thank you guys. That was, I personally learned a lot. I really liked the stories from the newspaper. Those were really colorful.
No problem. We had a lot of fun putting this together and doing the research. And hopefully people took something away from it. We wanted to make it more than just, here is the trolley, here's the way it's painted, here's what it looks like. You know, the stories themselves really, to us, make it interesting. And hopefully people learn something. You know, if you're not from Hanover, hopefully the system is a little interesting. So.
Yeah. If anyone has a question for Andrew or Matt, feel free to unmute yourself. You can do that by clicking at the bottom left of your screen. Or if you have a comment or a question about Hanover, they would be happy to answer it, I'm sure.
Hello, this is Andy Hoffman in Hanover. I had owned the trolley barns for about 30 years, my family. And an interesting thing, we had to cut a hole in the floor to install some equipment. And the jackhammer just kind of got lost into a big hole. As we went down into that hole, we found the grease pit was still intact. So the light bulbs are still screwed into the walls of the pit yet.
Wow.
So I have some crude pictures from back then and others of that property. So I'd be glad to share them with you at a future time.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you, Andy. That'd be
Yeah.
great. I can put our emails in the chat if you'd like, and that's open to anybody too. We don't mind sharing our emails. So, Andy, that would
Okay.
be neat. We'd love to talk to you some more.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did a lot of research on the property with Hanover Power and Light having generating there for many years. So I've got a bunch of information I'd be glad to pass on. And by coincidence, after the trolleys ended and you mentioned the bus service starting 1932, we ended up owning the bus building out York Street on the 800 block of York Street that became the terminal where they stored or maintained the buses, I guess, for bus service. I think it was called Border Bus.
Okay.
That's all.
Wow. No, Andy, that's great. As the crow flies, we live less than 500 feet from the car house.
Yeah.
So that's, I'll put our chats in or our emails in the chat for anybody, but yeah, that would be great. Really appreciate it.
Okay.
The stories are wonderful.
If anyone's having trouble unmuting themselves or turning their video on, just let me know. Do we have any other questions or comments? Joel says, interesting program. He remembers the day you found the 5 cars as a house. Fun day.
That it was. Yeah.
And I see. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Edward.
Matt and Andrew, great presentation, and Kristen, good hosting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Kristen, what is that background behind you?
New Orleans 832.
Okay, thank you.
And I saw a raised hand, Daryl and Chris.
Yes, my wife was watching with me and she said she once rode on the Mattapan Square in Boston when she was a child visiting her grandparents. And one thing I wanted to ask was, the Nawns, do you have information on what were the fares paid by the passengers?
No, that we don't have. No, we definitely still have some more research to do in local, preserved local newspapers. But we've not, that's not something we came across just yet, unfortunately.
Another thing I heard was one of the reasons that the line developed between McSherrystown to Hanover was the need to get the shoe factory workers in the buildings.
Exactly.
It
Exactly.
saved time and it was economical. It was a good source for workers.
Absolutely. Yeah, that really is the genesis. The industrial growth of Hanover, which the shoe company is one of the largest parts, is what led to the street railway.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lee.
You didn't mention what the gauge was on these lines.
The gauge is standard, and we found that both in Poor's Manual and as well as in the Electric Railway Directory, which enabled the physical connection with York. York Railways was also standard gauge, which is somewhat unusual for small Pennsylvania systems, but both were standard.
Also, I'd like to ask, did Hanover ever can vegetables? That label, is that from Hanover or is that some other Hanover?
Yes, that's part of Hanover brands, like Hanover beans and whatnot.
Okay.
That started in town. The factory, well, they own a couple plants now. The one is along 116, the York Road, just if you want to say east of the borough line. It's still actually a decent customer for CSX today, the railroad.
Yeah.
Oh,
And what's too, that's also a customer on CSX.
I see we have a raised hand. I'm not sure. Gary Solomon, are
Yeah.
you? Perfect.
That's
Go
me.
ahead.
Yeah. I just, what was the population of Hanover during the trolley era? I mean, it was big enough to have a trolley system, so.
Well, the borough itself, which was the largest, much larger than McSherrystown surrounding area, other than York, of course, when the trolley was founded, only had 3,700 residents. Now it grew. I mean, today the borough still only has, within the borough itself, 15,000. I want to say the greater area has about 40,000. If you stretch out like Penn Township areas in Southwestern School District and whatnot, but the borough only had 3,700 residents within the borough at that time.
Okay. Well, one other question. Did the Western Maryland had passenger service at one time? Did it have like service into Hanover, or between Hanover and Baltimore, I guess would be the closest city?
Yes. Yes, I want to say the last Western Maryland train, at least, based on some of the stuff we found, was around 1942. The Pennsylvania Railroad's line to Frederick, the former Northern Central branch, was also it was the York-Hanover and Frederick Railroad as a predecessor. They had passenger service till after World War II. Neither, though, again, both disappeared pretty early. I think the Western Maryland's was around 1942, at least their line, what they called the Dutch line in the Hanover.
It's hard to find any information on Western Maryland. It's really,
Yes.
right.
We've tried to look up some information about just as part of the local history as much. And that part of the system, there's not a lot of references, unfortunately.
Thanks.
Sure.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I see a hand there, Mr. Wissinger.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I have to give you a little bit of a personal history, so to speak. About 4 years ago, I started dating my present wife, and she lived in Hanover and also in Northern Maryland. She switched back and forth between her house and her daughter's house. At any rate, I stumbled on the interurban line from York down to Hanover by accident. I was coming down route, what is that, 441 or 114, so whatever, from US 30, and got through it's tough getting old. At any rate, I got on the roundabout there just outside of town and took the wrong road, which took me alongside the interurban line. And I'm looking and I said, boy, that sure does look somewhat familiar. I don't think that's a railroad line. And I saw the pole line going along. I said, that's got to be an interurban line. So every time I went down to visit my upcoming wife, I would drive down that right of way or the roads next to it to find out if I could get some more information. And one of the things that I stumbled on was one of the car stops, concrete shelter that apparently is still on the right of way. Mm-hmm. I can't tell you exactly where it is, but it's probably about a mile or two outside of Spring Grove. That's what I was trying to think of before. And then on 114, I believe it is, on the other route, there are one or two other shelters that have been moved off the line and set alongside for school bus shelters. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, and along that embankment, there's actually still a small little concrete bridge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's 116. And like you said, if you go into the square, or excuse me, the roundabout in Spring Grove, and you go to the north, they call it the Old Hanover Road. You parallel the right of way. It's well preserved in that area.
Oh, it is. Yeah. And it obviously was built to steam road standards. It was not along a highway or a railroad for just a short distance before it went across country. I was looking for more information on it, and I really welcomed. I had to come and see this. It was very good presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And my wife was, well, I offered to have her look at this too, and she recognized a lot of the stuff that you were talking about, but she didn't have the historic background of it, and so she learned a lot.
Good.
Great. Well, we're really glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, you learned so much from these. Mike has his hand up, and then I'll ask you to unmute there. Perfect.
Nice presentation. The connection between Car 200 and the inventor and what he went on to do, that's the kind of thing I really like to put in any kind of story, rather than just the nuts and bolts, which are nothing wrong with nuts and bolts, but this kind of presentation is really, really cool. I did a feasibility study for putting the trail on that high-speed right-of-way. So I spent some time out here, and I actually have on my screen here I found in Street View one of the trolley waiting sheds. If I could share a screen, I could show it to you. If it's all right.
Matt and Andrew, is that okay with you guys? We could do that really quick.
Real quick, if I might.
Okay. You are a temporary co-host.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, share screen. Yeah, share. That's it.
There you go.
Wow, yeah, that's cool.
We walked through it and talked to the property owner, and it's not in great shape, but it's definitely the real thing.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it could be brought back. I'll show you where it is.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Mike, is it, it is
We spotted
definitely
it from the
Trolley.
road. Was that?
It's definitely Trolley. It's not one of the Pennsylvania Railroad shelters from the parallel line?
I suppose that is possible. You know, I can't rule that out.
Because there are some shelters left from the line that connected, well, Hanover with Frederick and then Littlestown. I mean, it could be either. It's definitely, you know, the architecture looks like rail use.
You can see where it is now.
Stoverstown BAE system. Boy, it's well, you are like in the area between the interurban line and that part of the old Northern Central. You know, I want to say it's like flip a coin, because there's the Northern Central tracks, or the tracks are still there, although unused, and then the trolley parallel at that point.
So
Wow.
Well, it seems like the trolley here. You can see
Yes,
the
there you go.
kind of faded. So it had been brought from somewhere. So
Yeah.
I hadn't considered that it might be from the Pennsy. That may well be the case.
Oh, that's all right. What a find. I'm really glad you shared it with us,
Yeah,
no matter
Yeah.
what.
Yeah, that's good.
Thanks.
The other interesting thing is North Street in McSherrystown. There is a remnant of the line out there
Yes.
that I found, and you probably know about it. And I missed part of this presentation, and I regret that I did.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, we had a photo of that. The abutment at the end, the trestle abutment at the end of North Street.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's right there behind backyards next to a park.
From there, it was private right of way all the way to Littlestown. It's a nice, no traffic
yeah.
to contend with.
And Summit, where it hasn't been built on, you can still follow a lot of the right of way. In fact, where it left the street in Littlestown, there's a section 300 feet maybe. Before then, it goes in, through someone's backyard. But there's a section there.
Yeah.
Yeah, good stuff. Thanks for. I hadn't thought about this line in a while since I did that work out there, and so I wanted to tune it in. And I think you both did a fantastic job.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much.
Very well presented research.
Sure. Thanks for sharing what you had too. That's great.
Yeah.
That's another great thing about these programs is like people are like, oh, they're doing a show on Hanover, and then like everybody shares their knowledge, and then everyone's knowledge gets better.
Quick question for the Nawns. I believe Rohrback in his series of books did one on York County trolleys, and I think some of that covered the interurban line, but I don't think he ever did anything on the Adams County properties. And if you have seen that Rohrback to York County book, what'd you think of it?
It's, how do I put it with Ben's book? He did, he covered the interurban, and at least his later version did include Hanover. He had a couple pages. It's good that Ben did what he did. I know they were largely self-published, but the research he did, at least he preserved that pieces. And like, as we dug through his book, I have a copy, Andrew does as well. You find some of the references like from the Electric Railway Journal or Brill's magazine, and that can take you further with different, pieces of it. Listen, I know some would say something about Ben's book as, somewhat, by today's standards, a little crude, but at least he preserved a lot of information that I think would have been otherwise lost. And if you knew Ben, he was a heck of a nice guy. Ben was a neat guy. He was very active at one time at Rock Hill Trolley Museum before he got ill. But again, at least he preserved, I like to think he started saving a lot of this information that otherwise would be scattered throughout.
I know by 1950, 1960 standards, his books are fantastic. But again, that's 1950, 1960 standards. But, I've got a couple of them. I don't have them all, and I probably will never have them all because, I only picked up the ones that were areas of interest to me or connected to it. But, it's nice to to ask someone who's researched some of the area to get some validation on what you're occasionally reading.
No problem. You know, like I said, a lot of what he used, the foundational material, you'll find dates and things and charters, and you do some more research. You know, he abbreviated. I wish he had put more references, but if you go back and do it, you'll find his references are largely sound. And I said they're a great source to get more.
I'm a big equipment guy, so you know some of its roster is a little. You know, sometimes his rosters are a little. I guess I would say, at least from my side, would be wanting.
Yeah,
But basically, what's there is perfectly accurate. It just doesn't go far enough for me.
gotcha. Fair enough.
Mr. Vissinger again.
I forgot when I was talking about my experience tracing the line that there is a photograph in the East Penn Traction Club calendar. I think it was last year or the year before, of one of the York trolleys, and a little bit of a description. But that's the only photograph that I have seen of, you know, so your presentation was excellent.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
that photo is the one I'm thinking of. It's at the passing siding outside Spring Grove. There was a substation there that was
Yes.
there until 8-10 years ago. Oddly enough, my oldest son, who isn't with me tonight, we were going by the area one time. And as Andrew mentioned, his great grandmother spent a lot of time in Spring Grove in the trolley era. My oldest was going by one time and comes home, "Hey, Dad, they tore down the substation. I got a brick for you." I was like, really? He knew what it was. I was really impressed. I mean, he's led a trolley restoration project, but he's more into history than trolleys. But it was funny. He's like, "It's a little piece of brick." He goes, "Dad, it's all I could get, but I went by the area. I thought you'd like it." I'm like, "Hey, buddy, that's great."
Great. Do we have any other questions or comments for the Nawns?
I saw Kristen had a question. Are there any vestiges of the car sides inside the trolley houses? At least what I recall of the 5 cars made into a house. I want to say on one wall, perhaps there was like some of the window posts, but they largely, and this is from memory, I'd have to look back. Joel, if he's on, may remember some more. I know he took some photos that day, at least digital. I wasn't taking digital at the time, but I seem to recall pretty much everything was either, you know, fully encapsulated or areas have been removed, say, to provide vestibules or doorways, I should say, you know, into the house. But the ends were sticking out of the house. It was pretty cool.
Interesting.
You mentioned people that were aboard to operate the trolley cars. You said some of them were operated by a single person. Were there usually 2 on a trolley car operating the car, one in the front, one in the back, or?
In the early days, yes, they typically had what they called a motorman, and it's not the term's used because with George Gula went in it, a previous presentation, but most of the operators in the early days were male. And you had the motorman whose job was to basically run the car, run the controller and the brakes, and then a conductor who early on would rove around the car like a railroad conductor and check tickets. Later years was often stationed at the back. But a lot of companies starting in the 1920s would install safety devices. And what that would do is if the operator took his hand off of the controller, it would immediately apply the brakes and stop the car. That enabled the systems to go to one person, one man operation, especially with a fare. You put money in a fare box, operator would make your change and be responsible for running the car. But that largely came about in the 1920s. Like the York cars that were bought to re-equip the Hanover line in 1921, they were built for 2-person operation and then later converted. Hanover, the only 1-person cars we saw in Hanover were the Birney cars. They were also called safety cars because they had that feature. Because companies found one of the most, you know, one of the largest and continuously growing expenses were wages for the employees. And this was a way to go cheap, if you want to say.
All right. Any final questions for Andrew and Matt? All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you guys again so much. That was wonderful. We'll have it up on YouTube within the week or so. I am still working on getting George Gula's Women in Transit presentation up on YouTube. And today, if anyone was around for the Cincinnati presentation back in April, that presenter, Phil Lind, has agreed to put his on YouTube now as well. So within the next couple of weeks, we should have 3 new Trolleyologies on the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum YouTube channel. So check it out, subscribe, and we will see you guys again soon. Thanks again, Matt and Andrew.
Thank you.
Yeah,
This was
thanks.
a lot of fun.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
See ya.